Dear Chairman Nakajima, dear President Fujita, dear Vice President Morikawa, distinguished guests, dear ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues and friends, I'm honored and delighted to have the opportunity to offer you some opening remarks for this joint RIETI-IZA World of Labor Symposium on reforming labor market institutions to promote elderly employment. Before I start, I wish to deeply thank our hosts from RIETI for their hospitality and this fantastic opportunity to jointly present this symposium to you, which I'm convinced will be a very stimulating and inspiring event. In my opening remarks, I wish to focus on evidence-based scientific policy advice. IZA, my institution, the Institute for the Study of Labor, is an independent research institute broadly focusing on the analysis of global labor markets. And as President Fujita pointed out, we are also a network, actually the largest network of economists worldwide. And all the network contributes to our work. And on the basis of this work, our research and the resulting evidence, we also provide policy advice following our principle of evidence-based policy making. And this is also the central aim of IZA World of Labor, which I want to introduce to you. But before doing this, I would like to highlight some challenges we face in evidence-based scientific policy advice. Scientific guidance is essential for economic policy to be successful and ultimately promote welfare. But there are often misunderstandings and wrong expectations in the interactions between researchers, academic scientists on the one hand, and policymakers on the other hand. Researchers often don't feel understood, feel their research, their findings, their recommendations are often used only selectively and sometimes even may be instrumentalized to serve political goals. Policymakers, on the other hand, argue that the findings and the recommendations are out of touch with reality, often contradictory, delivered too late, and not adequate for the political process, since they simply don't provide easy and quick answers and universally valid, concrete, implementable recommendations. Empirical evidence on many issues is available, but not immediately of relevance or usable to policymakers. The reason is that academic science typically is not focused immediately on policy advice. Independent research must be performed over a longer period of time. It needs qualitatively suitable and accessible data. It needs powerful methodologies to obtain robust conclusions on causality and the effectiveness of policy programs. It requires publication of results in journals facing academic competition and peer review, and the adoption of highest quality standards. Thus, short-term answers are often not available. As a consequence, the evidence published in such scientific studies rarely fulfills the usability requirement of policymakers. In many cases, research findings have to be translated or made transparent to policymakers. Information policymakers need must be easily accessible, convenient to read, up-to-date, independent, comprehensive, and concise. Before we take a look at how evidence-based policy making can be supported, I would just like to have some brief definitions of these concepts. Evidence-based policy making is by no means new. It has been around for centuries, but it has to prove itself again and again in the political process. Labor economics is particularly well suited for evidence-based policy making. It's one of the most empirically grounded subfields in economics. It uses the instruments of data collection and econometric evaluation. Evidence is the rigorous presentation of solid statistically based findings, which programs work and which don't, accordingly to widely accepted standards of the discipline and published in journal articles. Evidence is needed since policymaking is experimenting with the truth. The effectiveness of policymakers must be constantly evaluated over time to be able to correct or adjust them. Evidence-based policymaking, in turn, is the adoption of this solid scientific evidence rather than ideology into policymaking in order to implement good policies and stop bad policies. Evidence-based scientific policy advice is exactly not researchers telling policymakers what to do, but rather to provide the viable options and highlight their implications such that policymakers can make ultimately their own decisions. Serious evidence-based policy advice is usually long-term oriented, sustainable, and focused on efficiency gains. But at the same time, it is not in the immediate interest of practical policymaking. Ideally, it should be designed in a way that the evidence is available for when the topics become politically ripe. Allow me just to give you some very brief perspective on German experience. Legislators in Germany have largely constructed external and independent institutions for the purpose of policy advice. We have an independent council of economic advisors, various advisory committee for the relevant ministries, and a number of public research institutes. In the 1990s, the German Research Council demanded an enhancement of the academic research to underline the policy advice, and it used as a prerequisite for their public funding of these research institutes. And this just led to a new understanding of policy advice, which should be based on research and the empirical evidence. A prime example for the power of evidence-based policymaking were the 2003 and 2004 major labor market reforms, the so-called Hartz reforms. They introduced, generally speaking, a greater emphasis on work incentives, individual responsibility, and flexibility into the labor market. But at the same time, they also systematically introduced the Anglo-Saxon type of accompanying scientific evaluation and efficiency-based assessment of each reform step into the policy process. The willingness of policymakers to accept this new paradigm has contributed significantly to the success of the reform policies. Even if the advice and the evidence has not always been accepted, it may have been a crucial element in the success of the reforms, since it enabled a clearer distinction between which instruments work and which don't, which ones are effective and which ones are superfluous. And thereby, it also led to a more effective use of public funds. Recently, Germany passed a law introducing a statutory minimum wage. And only due to massive pressure from the academic community, the bill was amended to include a paragraph that requires an impact evaluation of the minimum wage in 2020. Also, the installment in the Minimum Wage Commission, which has been installed, academics have not much of a say. And the data collection should have started with the decision of implementing the minimum wage in order to capture the anticipatory effects of the minimum wage. And these recent developments just show that this concept of evidence-based policymaking needs to prove itself again and again. What are prerequisites for evidence-based policymaking and the respective advice? To provide evidence-based scientific advice, not only the advice must be independent, but it must be based on prior independent research, scientific competition, rigorous peer review. All of this contributes to strengthen and guarantee the robustness of the results. We need disclosure of conflicts of interest, and we need data access in order to perform the evaluation of the policies, as well as to reproduce and verify previous results with newly developed methodologies. Data access is still a bottleneck that needs to be loosened. Data may not be available, or when it's available, there may be legal restrictions on the access or retention of official data. And furthermore, policy programs need to account for data collection before implementation. Evidence-based scientific policy advice obviously relies on policymakers who are open to engage in a dialogue. One could think of a legal requirement of independent scientific evaluation of new policies, which are first implemented in appropriate field experiments for a limited period of time before they're implemented across the board. We also need regular reviews of the effectiveness after implementation in order to correct these policies if necessary. Now, I would like to offer you one example on how to support evidence-based policymaking. As I pointed out, empirical evidence is available, but usually not relevant or usable by policymakers. There's an abundance of scientific studies on almost every policy question, but it's difficult for policymakers to identify the most reliable analysis, particularly in the case where the findings are not anonymous. What is the most appropriate methodology for analyzing the available data? What are the shortcomings and caveats of various findings? How do international findings compare? These are all relevant questions which need to be addressed. Thus, research needs to be, as I said, translated and made transparent to policymakers. And this is where our ambitious project IZA World of Labor, which we launched 1 year ago, aims to fill an important gap. It aims to be an independent service provider for evidence-based policymaking. It condenses the available state-of-the-art knowledge on major key labor market topics in an accessible style and practical format, and it derives functional policy recommendations and insight of value for society to society from the existing evidence. Thus, it provides support and guidance to decision makers in identifying, evaluating, and implementing the most appropriate policy option. Thereby, it aims to replace the distinction, for example, of right and left policies by those which make sense and those which don't. Furthermore, an important point is that it's freely accessible to a global audience, including not only policymakers, but also journalists, economic students, and the general interested public, thereby providing them with the information on the evidence which lies behind policy decisions. IZA World of Labor, therefore, is one example of how progress can be made in translating academic findings into policymaking. The topics we cover in IZA World of Labor are pretty broad. They range from migration, institutions, development issues, also environmental issues and labor market relations, to demography and family economics. Policy questions which are addressed are, for example, do migrants take the jobs of native workers? Or what are the employment effects of minimum wages? What are the effects, or what is the evidence on gender quotas on board of directors? And of course, we also have articles which deal with topics which are also of interest in today's symposium. Late life work and well-being. Is training effective for older workers? This is just a glimpse of the articles we have. At the moment, we have over 150 articles online, and they're meant to continuously grow. Just very briefly, you can read the articles online, download them as a PDF, and the first page gives you very briefly, why is this topic relevant? What does the evidence say? And what is the main message of the author? On the other pages, the evidence is discussed, caveats and limitations are highlighted, and then there's a policy conclusion. And there are also many other features on the website, among which one I find extremely interesting. I want just to mention it. We have so-called evidence maps. For every article we have online, we have a world map which shows where does the evidence we have come from which countries, and what kind of evidence is this. So to conclude, this is just one example on how we can support evidence-based policy making and support the dialogue between academic research and political praxis in the area of labor economics. So I invite you to visit the homepage and please consult the evidence, and I wish you a very stimulating symposium. Thank you.